So this is how I made this Scarlet Witch inspired table destruction. It's mainly a Houdini RBD sim, but I just wanted to give a little gimmick to it, and I just got done watching WandaVision, and so I was really inspired. So here's my original Houdini file for the table. Pretty simple setup, but I'll show you how to do it. There are a lot of little errors, like the pieces don't ever stop really rolling at the end. There's a lot of things in the render that I did to hide a lot of errors because I'm not that skilled at this program yet, and I like to cover my ass. But if any of you guys know Houdini and can help me with these little things, please let me know. But without further ado. Okay, so I'm going to drop down a file node. Press I to go into that. And then I'm going to select my table geometry, which I have included into the description with textures. I separated them into top and bottom for a very specific reason that I don't know if it's worth it or not, but it's always good to have more control than less control, especially in visual effects. So I'm going to merge these together. And if somebody that knows Python can code a shortcut to just press M and make a merge node kind of like in Nuke, that would be incredible. Then I'm just going to fracture both of these pieces separately. And that's why I separated them, because I didn't know if the RBD material fracture would be able to fracture these two different pieces of wood. Like this is all thick and sturdy, and this is more of a thin sheet. So I didn't know if the program was going to be able to determine that based on the geometry and then fracture accordingly. So I separated them so that way I can do that myself. I think in the end, the program actually does a pretty damn good job. So shout out to side effects, but I didn't know going into it, and I'm not super skilled in Houdini yet, so that's why I did this. Regardless, I'm going to drop down an RBD material fracture, and let's do the top first. We're going to let this cook. And it's already fractured it, but it's done it in a concrete style, as you can see. So we're going to change that to wood. So this guide geometry here, I'm going to put it on grains. And when I do that, you can see the cut that it's actually doing inside this piece of geometry. By default, I actually like the spacing of this. I actually like the pattern. I don't think I changed this much. But I did change is cuts. If we look at cuts, I thought this was way too wide for the pieces that I wanted, even if that's more realistic. I'm not sure. I didn't do much R&D, but to me, I wanted these pieces to be smaller. And so if you go under cut, which we're visualizing, the spacing, I think I lowered that to make them closer together. So let's try 0.1. See, and that's a lot more cuts now. That's a little too close for my liking, but again, I'm not going to dial these numbers in too much because I just want to show you the foundation of how to build this effect, and then you guys can go and play and, you know, tweak to your heart's desire. So I'm going to roll with that. So already we have this piece of geometry that's fractured. I want to do the same thing to the bottom. I'm just going to copy this node, Control C, Control V. It's going to cook because it's going to paste it connected to this top one. And there it is. I'm going to hold down Y and cut that connection and put it underneath bottom. Okay, so we visualize this one. It's going to cook. And by default, I actually don't mind this that much. I think I'm actually just going to leave this and move on, which is what I was saying before. I thought the program probably could have just done this. Let me just take a look at the grains. See, for this one, I may even do wider, but I wanted these legs to fracture separately. I should have done the legs as a separate piece of geometry. But so I'm going to drop down a null to keep things organized, and I'm going to call this fractured out. And I'm going to make that yellow. And then here I'm going to rename this to table. And it will recook because all the RBD material fractures have to reference this new node name. So ideally, probably you should do this before. Let's keep this organized. So I made this a green color. Okay. Now we have our geometry. Okay, so once the table's fractured, I just used the shelf tools and I clicked RBD glued objects, and that will generate an auto dot network for you. And if I press L, with glue constraints. So the table's here, but if we press play, it's just gonna fall. So we're gonna need a ground plane, and I'm gonna pipe that in under the solver into this merge, and then put it above this way. It's just organized. And so if I play it now, nothing will happen. You just have a table. And that's because we saw it falling before. This red lines you see, that's the glue constraints. That's the relationship that's holding these pieces together. If I go to a wireframe, you can see a little bit better. So what we've done, we fractured this piece of geometry, and then we've clicked on the RBD glued objects. What that's doing is it's taking those fractured pieces, and if you want to visualize it, it's almost like they took all those pieces, slapped a bunch of Elmer's glue, and then stuck the thing back together. Now that glue is holding these pieces based on a strength that you can define. So if I want this to be some Gorilla Glue, I can increase it. If I want it to be some Elmer School Glue, that I can decrease it. So all I did to make the table go up, like Scarlet Witch, was I gave it an initial velocity. If you go into the table right here, all it's done is it's importing it, and then this initial state velocity, so X, Y, Z, I want it to go up. Let's just start by 5. So now when I press play, you can see the table bounces up. It's a bouncy table though. Like, I don't think a table would bounce like this if even from that height. So what I did was into physical, there's a bounce parameter, and you can make that 0.1 maybe. And that's a little bit better. It's more realistic. But again, I wanted to rotate and do all this fun stuff. So I just played around with these values. So angular velocity is like your rotational velocity, and normal velocity is like positional, if that's even a word. You can see if I make this 10, it's going to shoot towards us. But if I make it 100, maybe it should just rotate. So you can play with these values as much as you want. I'm just going to do a random one for fun. Let's keep 100 there. Let's do 240 and 50, yeah. No, I want it to do a little bit different. I want it to hit like a corner or something more destructive. Let's try 300 here. Yeah. Let's make this table just absolutely go wild. What I did to make it not, you'll see that it's happening just on frame 1, which may be desirable for you, but if it's not, you want to activate it on a certain frame. Here's how you do that. So on this packed object, you'll see this creation frame. It's already keyframed on 1. I'm going to hold Control, Alt, and press it, or Control Shift, I'm sorry. Press it, and that will get rid of the keyframes. And then, let's say I wanted to start on frame 24, which is what I had in mind. I can just press 24. And you can see if we Control up arrow, we'll reset and go back to frame 1. It won't appear until frame 24. But now you're thinking, oh, well, where's my table now? Up until frame 24. It doesn't come till frame 24. How do I fix that? And here's how you do that. We're actually going to go back out of the dot network into the actual geometry. And you can see the glue constraint thing has, or the shelf tool has created some new nodes, and we can just drag those out of the way to stay organized. So I'm going to put down a switch node, which is basically like if you think of train track crossroads, it just basically will change the path. It's like a toggle. And I'm going to put my first input as this fractured out null that we created, which is just the table. It's just already fractured. You could put it on this merge node if you'd like, but I want the geometry to stay the same. If there's maybe in your geometry, maybe there's like a little seam or something, and in your actual geometry there is no seam, when you switch between the two, you may see the difference, almost like a pop or flicker. And so I'm trying to keep the exact same geometry throughout. So that's why I chose to do the fractured out. Plus, I don't think there's anything wrong with the geometry before it gets fractured. So then all I'm going to do is put the dot import node as my second switch. So what am I doing here? So basically this allows me to switch between these two at any given frame. So the stop import node is basically pulling the information from this node. Everything that goes on in here, what this produces, this is pulling that information in. If I view this, you're basically viewing this. And so in the table, I knew that it started on frame 24. So on the switch node, I'm going to keyframe this to be, I'm going to hold Alt and press. I want it to be the first input until frame 24. If you notice, after frame 24, nothing happens. Even if I view the switch, nothing happens. So on frame 24 though, or rather frame 24, I should be keyframing this, not on frame 1. So on 24, which is one frame before I want the effect to activate, it'll be this input. I go one frame forward, I'm going to switch this to 1. And as you can see it already, you can see the effect. I'm going to hold Alt and keyframe this again. So now on frame 24, we have the original table, and on frame 25, we're starting the effect. And that's how you can control how to start your effects on given frames. Okay, so how do we get this table to break? Because right now it's like so strong, which may be actually pretty realistic, but we want this table to be weak. So back into the simulation node. Under these glue constraints, there's a strength here. And let's just lower this to maybe 200. And now we have a table that's breaking. But it's not really breaking in some, the pieces don't look that great. And, some of these pieces are flying out of nowhere. Okay, so one thing that I noticed that I did was in my RBD material fracture, under cluster, I changed these cluster types from combined pieces to group constraints. And I'm not sure what happens when you do that, but for some reason I got much, much, much better results, specifically when destroying wood. So I'm going to do that for both settings. If you know what's going on, please let me know. But yeah, I got much better results when I changed them to group constraints in terms of aesthetic, how it looked. So now if we will preview our animation, you can see the table now breaks apart and looks far better than what it was looking like before. I'm not sure what is going on under the hood there. If somebody knows what's going on and what that, please let me know. But already you can kind of see we've got something that looks interesting. If we want to switch it up again, we can. We can switch, settings all day and make, the most impact that you're going to get is switching in the auto dot network. If you go into your glue constraints, this strength and probably the initial state of your object is going to be two of the biggest impacts on how your destruction will look. So I want to make this maybe, I don't know, let's say 500. Let's go crazy. So it just chews through the table. And see, now you have those legs that come down. That's kind of interesting. But as you can see, the pieces will just continuously roll and roll and roll and roll and roll. That's another thing also that I tried to fix, but I could not find a fix. I increased the friction, I lowered bounce, I did all types of things, and could not figure out a way to stop that. Even if you watch my original render, there's always pieces moving. So, yeah. Okay, so to keep things organized even more, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down a file cache and underneath the DOP import node, because that's where the table break's happening. If you can see, this is before where it happens on frame 24. And I want to cache that out. That way I don't have to have Houdini keep cooking this over and over and over again. So this is where you would select where you want to save it out. bgeo.sc is fine for Houdini, but if you want to take this into another program, then you'll have to use something like ABC, FBX, some sort of geometry file. But for Houdini, this is just fine, bgeo.sc. You can click save the disk and you'll be just fine. Then every time you hover over this, it should load from disk. What I'm going to do though is because the DOP import node comes in, if you look at the geometry, when the geometry comes in, it's not fractured at all. It's plain. And that's because it comes in, or plain, what is this, a flavor? Comes in with no fractured pieces. And that's because it's packed. It's a packed object, so you have to unpack it. So if you drop down an unpack node underneath the DOP import or underneath the file cache, doesn't necessarily matter. You should get all your pieces back. as well as your information in terms of all your primitives and groups and all whatnot. Then I'm going to drop down a null under the unpacked node, and I'm going to say unpacked for debris. In fact, I'm actually going to put this underneath the switch, because if everything's correct now, it should be the exact same geometry going up, the same geometry coming down with all the same points, primitives, groups, and everything and whatnot. So once I have that, we'll make that yellow again. Then all I'm going to do is take this and go to debris and press the debris shelf tool. This will create three new nodes rather. If we go to debris source, which is the source of our debris, it's referencing the null from before. And it's actually unpacking it already, but that's fine. If I go into the debris sim, the same issue that we had with the table we're going to have here. So we're going to need to drop down a ground plane as well as a merge. And we're going to put the ground plane in with that. And again, we're going to hide it. And if we play this, we should start to see when our table gets created, all the particles. But obviously this is far too many. We're going to be having smoke go everywhere. We kind of just want them to appear once the table breaks. So I will also show you how I combated that. Okay, so what I did to combat all these particles spawning on birth is I went into the frame right before it starts to break, which to me looks about to be 48. Oops. Seems to be 49 is when it hits. So at frame 48, I'm going to turn everything off. So on the pop source under birth, you have impulse activation and constant activation. I'm going to put both at 0, keyframe it, and go 1 frame forward and put them at 1 and 1, keyframe. And if you replay, let's just see what happens. Now you're seeing you're getting the particles only spawning when the ground hit, or when the table hits, which is what we wanted. But they're continuously spawning over and over and over, and it's also not desirable. You're going to have smoke. We're trying to birth smoke from these particles, and so like if they keep spawning, we're just going to have smoke ever coming out, and that's not also the effect that we want. So to fix that, we're going to take, first off, we're going to chop this in half, the amount of particles that birth. So we go under the pop solver, and under, I think it's collision behavior, right? So we're going to add a hit attribute. So when they hit the floor, the response, we want them to die, I believe. And so you'll see when the particles hit the ground, they die. In fact, I want it to stop, I believe, not die. Yeah, that's far better. And then to stop them from spawning, I think I just did the same thing from before, where I went under the constant activation. And I think I only let it go for like 5 frames. Then I keyframed them again, went 1 frame forward, and made them 0. And now if we replay, we should just get a good chunk of particles when the initial burst happens and then no more. And that's exactly what we have. So this would be our source for our pyro. And again, you could go under debris, because this is basically a node that just re-imports all this for you. See, there's just a dop import in here. And again, you could do your unpack. And then if you had groups and stuff, and then you could do a file cache, which is what I did. Or not file cache. And then again, you could just save these out, load them from disk. So to get rid of this ground plane, it's kind of annoying every single time you import something, it comes back. Under this object mask, you can add a caret and then ground plane, the name of the object, and the up caret and then the name of the object, which we'll get from the debris sim. So this, right here, ground plane 1. If we name this floor and then went back under here and reset the simulation, you see it's there now, and all we gotta do is change this to floor and it gets rid of it. That's a handy way to isolate certain things in your scene. So now we have this source for pyro. So you can guess another shelf tool. We select the debris, go to pyro effects, and I think I use wispy smoke. Just pressed it, and then you just press play, and it's really, well, actually, one more thing before we press play. Another ground plane. And take off the display. And now if we press play, you'll see we have some pyro that shows up. But it's chunky and big and not what you want. And it lifts up like fire. So quickly, I just went to the pyro. Division size is like your resolution. I'm gonna start at 0.08. And under the pyro solver, buoyancy lift is lifting it. So this is how much, and this is like an influence factor. So buoyancy direction is like, or rather the opposite, I'm sorry. Buoyancy direction is what direction the smoke's gonna travel in, and buoyancy lift is basically a multiplier. So if we make this, I want the smoke to rise, but very little, so 0.1, and I want the influence to be very, very low, so maybe 0.3. And time scale, maybe a little bit slower, just to give it a more dramatic, slow type of rise. Cooling rate, I want the smoke to cool very quickly. I want it to dissipate very fast because it's not fire. It's supposed to be just like some debris on the floor. So maybe 0.8. And under shape, we can actually turn up the dissipation to 0.6 to make it go quicker. I want it to dissipate fast again. And let's just see what that looks like. So that's a little bit better. It's still rising and a little bit too big for my liking. So again, we can go back maybe 0.05. And I'm going to give it shredding, some turbulence, and you can look up, I don't really want to go into all these. There's tons of pyro tutorials on what all these mean. So if we go back, the pyro thing has also created 2 nodes. So if we view pyro, the pyro import node is again importing it. This time you have 2 different input nodes. One for your variables, I like to call them, and then one for your geometry. So this is where you put your file cache node to bring it into Blender. You put a file cache, but the thing about Blender is you need to make it a VDB. So you'll need to drop down a convert VDB node right here, and make sure that the group is set to whatever groups you want to bring into Blender. If you want to bring in density, heat, and temperature, and then convert them to a VDB. And then you want to do your file cache. And then when you import that into Blender, everything should be just fine. But that's very important. It will not work if you don't include this. So if we view this with our imported debris, with our table, we should get kind of the effect here. And you can see that's so much more smoke than you'd ever probably want in a scene like this. So let's very quickly get rid of all that smoke. One thing you can do is, I think the debris is just spawning too much. So into the debris sim, I'm going to go into the pop solver, or the pop source, I'm sorry. And I'm going to take these keyframes and I'm going to move them really close to the other ones. I'm going to move them to be really close. So it's only being activated for a couple frames. So under source density from debris, there's this scale on density. I'm going to make it 0.3. Makes it a little bit thinner. So under source density from debris, there's this scale on density. I'm gonna make it 0.3. Makes it a little bit thinner. Also though, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make this dissipate a lot faster, maybe 0.9. And under simulation, the cooling rate, I'm gonna make 0.9 with not that much buoyancy lift and more shredding. Another thing you can do is under the debris sim, take this and chop it maybe to 500. Just get far less particles spawning. And that's pretty much the effect in Houdini. I know I didn't really go too much in depth on what all the features and everything is, but there's tons of other tutorials. I just wanted to quickly run through how I did the effect. Let me just lastly show you how I got this into Blender, and then I'll show you how to do the Scarlet Witch effect. So I know I kind of went over how to get some things into Blender, but so to get the geometry from the table, we can drop a ROP alembic, and you're just going to save this right here. You can make sure it's under the switch or else you won't get the geometry that stays there. And you'll just save this with a frame range and import that into Blender. And you can use motion blur. You can tinker all of this, but alembic is the way to go when you're doing geometry in Blender, and VDB is the way to go when using volumes. So you just do a ROP alembic here. In the debris, if you wanted to get that out, you could do a ROP alembic. And in the pyro, I already described you would convert it to VDB and then file cache that out. So I'll hop into After Effects and I'll show you how I did the energy effects. So here's my comp for the original project. And it really is just as simple as using the God Video Copilot Saber plugin, just with some comp tricks to make it look a little bit better. But that's really the basis of the effect right here. I mean, it really doesn't take much. When somebody makes such a great tool, you just kind of reap the benefits of it. So the thing that sells this effect though is the light around the environment. And I'm not going to do a tutorial on the environment. I can if you'd like me to, but I know people wanted to know how I probably did the effect and not the environment. But what's the number one thing to get this, any sort of energy effect to look good or realistic, is to have actual light that is being produced from these effects. The number one thing in all of CG or compositing CG to fake or live action or whatever is creating light. It is near impossible. It's not impossible, but it's near impossible. You always want to make sure you can have a practical light that is being created from these sort of things. And so what I did is in my 3D program, and I can show you in another video if you'd like, but you want to place a light. If I take away the energy effects and I take away all the extra flare, this was my scene. If I go and I solo my plate, this is the plate. And you can see it, everything illuminates red. So all I did was I placed 4 lights by the stool, the bottom of the table. I placed 4 lights by the bottom of the table and 1 kind of in the top. And I just animated them to basically turn on and off. But that's how you're going to get these realistic light that catches around the environment and the object and whatnot. You're never going to be able to create, I mean, look how different the table looks here to here. I'm never going to be able to create that. So then all you do on top of your plate to get the effect to look good is you make a solid. We'll apply Saber. And for right now, I'm going to hide this layer. Then all I did was good old-fashioned roto. Now, again, if somebody knows, I'm sure there's a way to do this, but I had a matte of my object. I rendered out a matte layer. If there's a way to do an outline matte, that would be a really easier way to do this, but I couldn't figure it out for some reason. So I did the old-fashioned way, which was just to mask in roto. So I literally just went through and I rotoed. And I'll just do a dirty roto real quick. And I went through and I just went like this. And Roto, honestly, I know nobody ever wants to do it anymore, but surefire way to get results, let me tell you. So once you have a mask, then I unhide my saber layer and I go into customize core, and the core type I'm going to set to be my layer masks. And now you have the saber following in the shape of your geometry. We want to make this a screen layer. Now that's on top of our plate. And once we make it red, instantly we get something that looks like it's illuminating the environment because it matches. And the cool thing about Saber is there's tons of presets and they all look so good. So you can just run wild with it. I think I might have just used energy. And I went to red. And there's already a different effect that looks interesting. So all I did then was on my actual Saber layer was I just animated the mask, just, hand by hand to go up with the table. It's not perfect, but it worked. And if we solo that, then all I did was I animated the core size off and on. And to get a cool ignite effect, like it comes in different areas like this, all I did was I pre-composed a displacement map, basically, to like the end. If you watch closely, the effect kind of turns off from bottom to top and kind of comes in from random areas. And I just did that using a fractal noise. And I just animated the brightness and the contrast to turn on from almost like a black to white matte. And then I just threw in a solid. And with that solid, I almost used like a flag painting out areas. I made it ignite from bottom to top and then turn off from bottom to top. And so I just had this custom alpha matte that I can use as a reveal. And it's really subtle, but without it, let's see. If we turn off the Luma matte with no track matte, this is what you would have. And it's still good, don't get me wrong. I still like it. But I preferred the sort of more random approach. I mean, and really, that's it. It was really a simple effect. And then all I did to add to it was I added a couple lens flares. So I added this one. I added another one. I added some flicker. I added some curves. I put a vignette. Did some more color adjustments. I put some grain. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I have some hue saturation things kind of to make the table and the background. Here's some fog for the background. I use that using a Z map coming out. And I could do a tutorial on that as well, on how to export all this stuff from Blender, actually. My Blender render passes. But that was just a Z depth matte. And it's really grainy. But I was able to kind of degrain it and make it a little bit nicer. And I just used that with some fog exponential from Sapphire. And use the Z map. And that way I can change this into any color I would have wanted. Make the environment a little bit more appealing. And then some AO. And I think that's about it. And then it's just all about animating things to turn off and on and whatnot. And then you get something like this. I'll open up my Blender file and give you a quick run through. Okay, so here I am in the Blender scene. So all I did was I imported this table. So these are the 4 area lights I was talking about. So if I go into Eevee, I don't want to go into cycles because it may explode my computer. But if we let this cook for a second. So these are these 4 area lights I was talking about, and I don't think you'll see these in cycles because I don't think cycles supports the lights right now. I don't know why that's not working. Let's turn on cycles, why not? So you'll see these 4 area lights that I placed in the scene, and I just animated them here with the power to turn off and on. And here's that one big light I was talking about up top. And I just animated those to turn off and on. So back to Eevee. When the table hits the ground, and I didn't move this at all. Like when you import your things from Houdini, I think Blender and Houdini both work in meters scale. So if your things look good in Houdini, when you import them into Blender using ABC, it should look pretty much identical to what it looked like in Houdini. So you shouldn't have any issues there. And then, yeah, I just built this rough environment, kind of like underground parking structure kind of thing. Really rough. And I just built like this window for like a shadow catcher. Sorry, I'm kind of moving all around the place. I thought just to give it a little bit more interesting shadows, if you look at the render, you'll see like some shadows behind. But yeah, and then it was just as simple as animating a camera to kind of just, go forward, look up, follow the table. Some foreground elements to give some visual interest. And then that's pretty much it. I just went to the compositing tab and I made a bunch of render layers, which you don't see here because I think this is I think I made a different project. But you would just add them here. So to get your AOVs, you go into compositing, you select use nodes, and then on this file output, you probably won't see this, or this. You probably just see something like this. Something just like this. So you go here, and you can add an input, name it whatever you want. So let's say I want to get the diffuse direct. I can say diffuse direct, and then on my passes tab, I can say diffuse direct, and now it will show up here, diffuse direct, and you just drag that there. And then now you have a pass. And you can save it wherever you want. I saved it here, VO6 passes, as TIFFs, and everything's set up. I absolutely love the way Blender does AOVs. It's primarily one of the reasons why I love finishing my projects in Blender, just because I love the way that it's able to set me up for success in comp. And I know it's probably easy to do all this stuff in Houdini too, but it just makes more sense for me in Blender. So if possible, I like to be able to do everything at the end in Blender. And I can go more into depth if you guys want on any of this stuff. I just figured I would do a really quick, brief kind of overview because there's so many beginner tutorials out there that I see it's kind of pointless to teach beginning over and over and over and over again. I just kind of wanted to quickly run through how I did it, so that way you guys know and then you can run with it. But again, if there's anything else in specific that you want me to go into detail, let me know. And that's pretty much it.